Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. This is Ocean Robbins, and I am joined by my dad and colleague, John Robbins, and welcoming our guest, Dr. David Perlmutter. Dr. Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist and four-time New York Times best-selling author. He serves on the board of directors and is a fellow of the American College of Nutrition. Dr. Perlmutter serves as a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease and has published extensively in peer-reviewed scientific journals, including Archives of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and the Journal of Applied Nutrition. His books have been published in 34 languages and include the #1 New York Times bestseller, Grain Brain. His most recent book, written with his son, Austin Perlmutter, MD, is Brainwash: Detox Your Mind for Clearer Thinking, Deeper Relationships, and Lasting Happiness. So now, David, my dad and I are so grateful to you for all of your outstanding work, and we're so glad to have this time with you. And now for this interview, I'm going to hand it over to my dad and colleague, John Robbins.
Well, thank you, Ocean, for that introduction, and thank you, David, for being with us once again.
Well, I am delighted. You know, we've been doing these for a couple of years now, and it's always a pleasure.
It's always a thrill for me to talk with you. Your wisdom, your intelligence, your clarity, your insights are always penetrating, important, practical, and also freeing. I love reading your books, and I love talking with you.
Well, thank you, and feelings mutual. And so that said, I want to thank you for always allowing me to share these words if they're interesting and helpful to people. That's what it's all about. And you've been doing this for so many years. Your first book caught me very much off guard in the day. I wasn't quite ready for it. You know, the whole narrative about your early life and the family business, and I'm sure that your listeners know what I'm talking about. It was interesting. I wasn't ready at that point to embrace what you were talking about. But interestingly, as we move through the years, the author of Grain Brain, that some people took to be the Atkins diet redux, in other words, we're just going to keep eating meat on, and here's why. It was never meant to be interpreted as such. There was not a single word in there that would lead anyone to believe that. But because it was low carb, low refined carbs, it got lumped in the Atkins-like mentality. And, you know, these days, what you're hearing me say is that we are omnivores. We can certainly eat and tolerate and do pretty well with a variety of foods, provided they meet quality standards. But that by and large, most of what needs to be on the plate are colorful vegetables. And I want to be as clear as I can about that statement, that it's very important for ourselves and for those around us and for the planet to consider a more plant-based diet. We've recognized that a more plant-based diet is important, not just for me, the narcissistic part, but for you and for our planet, the empathy part. Hearing a lot of arguments that these days especially, there's sort of a resurgence in the notion that, we are basically carnivores. The more we think about our hunter ancestors, the better. And an attempt to deny pretty pervasive and compelling science that there is a significant trauma to our planet that we experience with the provision of meat for human consumption. I think the data that shows that, on balance, less agriculture driven towards meat production is better, has a less significant footprint and impact on us moving forward. So, and the planet moving forward. I wanted to set your listeners kind of a better view, better sense as to what our messaging is all about moving forward.
I appreciate that very much, David. You're an inspiration to me sometimes what we know already can prevent us from learning. And one of the things I keep learning from you is how important it is to keep learning. And I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of a whole foods, plant-based diet for the health of the planet, as well as for the health of each of us. Now, I'd like to turn to your new book, Brainwash. In it, you speak eloquently and powerfully about how important connection is in our lives, connection. And you also speak of how we've become disconnected from our bodies, from each other, from the natural world, and all of that with seriously dangerous consequences. And you then take it a step further. You say that our lifestyles today, including the foods we eat, are disconnecting us from our ability to live with wisdom and good judgment. David, you're a neurologist. You have an intimate knowledge of the workings of the human brain. It seems to me that in Brainwash, you're saying that the disconnection that is so pervasive in our society and in our lives today is also playing out in our brains.
We've become disconnected from important parts of our brains. And I will say that this is really the nuts and bolts of Brainwash. This is really, I think, the central theme. And that is, as you'll know, that we developed the thesis that there are really two very important parts of the brain that we utilize in our decision-making process. One area of the brain called the amygdala, and actually it should be amygdalae since we have two of them, one in either temporal lobe, lives right behind our ears. This is an area that is reptilian, it's primitive, and it gives us the ability to make sudden, impulsive decisions, to do things very instantaneously without really thinking about them. What are the long-term consequences? How might they affect other people? How might they affect me in the future? How might they affect the planet, etc.? It is a self-centered way of making decisions. I want to eat this now. I don't care about the consequences. I want to do things that might endanger other people because I care only about myself. I want to do things that only, have to be considering today, but not tomorrow. And I can certainly not embrace the notion that what I decide to do might in some small way affect the health of the planet. That's the amygdala. On the other hand, we are connected to an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex that lives behind our foreheads. And it is this gift of the prefrontal cortex that we have more than any other animal. So we have this gift of this huge area of the brain that allows us to consider our decisions in terms of not how it's going to play out right now, but what might this decision do for us tomorrow, in a week, in our future? How might this decision affect me, for sure, but also how might this decision affect other people around me in my community? And how might this decision affect the planet upon which we live? Now, both of these areas are active, both have their upsides and downsides. We want to have decision-making come from the amygdala at times. We want to act suddenly and impulsively. Should we be backing our car out of the driveway and we look in the camera and we see a kid on a tricycle? You don't want to think about that. You want to say, gee, maybe it'd be a good idea at this time for me to go ahead and take my foot off the accelerator, put it on the brake, and apply pressure. That can't happen. We know that won't turn out well. We want to bing. Luckily, we have it happened and we don't remember the whole process. It happened when, whoo, thank goodness. But on the other hand, acting impulsively and in a self-centered way, by and large, for our day-to-day decisions doesn't serve us well. Deciding to polish off a dozen glazed donuts because we want to, darn it, I'm going to do it. That's an impulsive, self-centered response to the challenge of the jelly donuts or glazed donuts that doesn't think about how that might impact your blood sugar, your insulin sensitivity, et cetera, your obesity, your inflammation levels moving forward in the future. That's a prefrontal activity. Now, the connectedness part, to get back to what led us into this discussion, is really very important. Because the prefrontal cortex is, in fact, connected to the amygdala. It is the adult in the room. It tempers the amygdala's responses. It exercises what we call a top-down control, whereby we generally, if there's good connection, are able to rein ourselves in. We're able to make those lifestyle choices, for example, that we know are good for us. We're able to do things by thinking of others that might otherwise be harmful to others. We're able to make decisions that plan for the future. That is this top-down control that the prefrontal cortex has when it is wonderfully connected to the amygdala. Now, two other aspects of disconnection syndrome I'll mention briefly, having focused on what really the book is mostly concerned with. And that is the disconnection that we have from other people. That certainly that type of disconnection is fostered by the world in which we live, where partisanship and divisiveness is really the order of the day, and it's not serving us 100% well. And finally, I'll mention, because I think it's important, and we can talk about this on multiple levels, certainly diet and the sources of our food play into this, the disconnection that people have basically with the planet upon which we live, which needs to be nurtured as well.
It does. It so does. And we have these brains, these spectacular, I think, brains. I mean, I've sometimes thought of the human brain, which is roughly about 3 pounds of highly vascular tissue encased in our skulls. It's a small thing. It's around 3 pounds. It's maybe 2% of our body weight or less. And yet it uses 25% of our energy. And our brains and those of the other hominoid species that have lived on this planet have, over time, brilliantly adapted to changing conditions over the course of actually several million years. And yet the human brain, for all its magnificence and for all its wonder, it does run on programs that today I think are being hacked by modern technologies, similar to how a computer virus can infect software and change the way it operates. An example would be we have a primal desire for sweet food. And that served us well when the sweetest foods available were berries, and those were only available for limited times each year. Now, our primal desire to seek out and eat as much food as we could find once served us well when we had to worry about the scarcity of food, and there were food famines often, particularly during winters. David, is it now the case that what were once valuable adaptations that helped us to survive have now become entry points for exploitation?
Exactly. We explore that thesis in great depth in Brainwash, and it really speaks to the idea that the fact that an individual does have difficulty controlling his or her consumption of sweets, for example, it speaks to the idea that it's not necessarily their fault. It's part of a very deeply ingrained program. Our brains are programmed to respond pleasurably. We get a pleasure sensation when we consume sweets, so we do more of it. It's the same reason that we are so attracted to social media, because we are at a very primitive level programmed to want to be involved with other people, that socializing with others has always been an issue that allowed us to survive, a survival mechanism with division of labor, but nonetheless coming together to share in the bounty of that division of labor. So that's been a powerful survival mechanism, along with our desire for sweet and multiple others, which serve as entry points, again, for us to be exploited. The notion of being on social media is a sense of connectedness. It in fact does allow us to be connected to some degree, but at what cost? So these are powerful points of exploitation. Dietary fat, to some degree, the same way. Dietary salts, some degree, the same way. But the overwhelming issue, I think, as it relates to our health, and as we developed in the book, our contentedness, and we should explore that term, is the exploitation of our desire for sweet.
And for the sweetness of connection with each other. And we live in a society that in many ways does not cultivate, does not support meaningful relationships between people. We have a facsimile of it. We don't actually meet face to face that much, and we have Facebook. Surveys find that the average internet user today spends more than 2 hours a day on social networking. We spend a ridiculous amount of time fixated on our screens, be they television or smartphone or computer or tablet or other device. It seems clear to me that spending all this time staring at screens is contributing to a culture of disconnection. I saw a recent study that found that the more time that people spend on Facebook, the higher their rates of depression and the worse they felt. And in fact, the more time they spent on Facebook, the worse their mental and physical health became. David, is it true that the more time we spend on social media, such as Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and the others, the more we are, in effect, cutting off access to the highly evolved part of the human brain that lets us see the big picture and make well thought out, wise decisions?
Absolutely. One of the biggest issues that social media does is it fans the flames of narcissism. It's all about look at me. And it's all about comparison of your perceived self-image and that image that's put up, obviously modified by others about their wonderful lives. So constantly on social media are comparisons, constantly being bombarded with the sense of not measuring up in terms of my looks, in terms of my health, in terms of my wealth. They're constantly bombarded by advertising. You've got to buy this or that. This will be your key to happiness. And constantly bombarded by the notion that other people are doing better. Therefore, I do not have enough. Therefore, I'm not content. So it's, the goal of life is to feel like you have enough. And there's nothing worse than social media, I think, to fan the flames of discontent. We now see statistics indicating that as many as 6% of people globally will qualify for the definition of internet addiction. And the definition is use of the internet, excessive use of the internet, such that it interferes with normal living. It creates a severe stress not only on the individual, but on loved ones as well, and interferes with productivity. And it's been found that there's some pretty worrisome statistics associated with being addicted to the internet, that it affects perhaps 250 million people. That's 5 times the population of Great Britain. That these individuals have twice the risk of suicide, and if they're under 18 years of age, a 4-fold increased risk of suicide. Being on the internet excessively, when you look at the brains of these people, of course, with brain scanning, like functional MRI, you see changes. You see, for example, decreased size of what is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is this huge white matter pathway that connects our hemispheres to each other, the brain's hemispheres to each other. I guess that could be another part of disconnection syndrome, wouldn't it? All brought on by just dedicating or maybe giving up too much of our lives, too much of our attention to this addictive situation called the internet.
Well, so many of us are ensnared in that kind of a trap, with the result that our brains are increasingly running on programs that are designed and controlled by others.
Yes.
And often by commercial interests that want to capture and exploit the part of our brains that desire instant gratification. Now, the companies that manufacture and sell us highly processed food argue that they're just fulfilling a human need. And in fact, they say they're helping us to become the people we want to be, no longer slaves to the kitchen, no longer imprisoned in the kitchen and slaves to the stove. But there is another viewpoint. Michael Moss, for example, the author of the very well-known book, Salt, Sugar, and Fat, says that in their hands, in the hands of these companies that are manufacturing processed foods in our stores, in their hands, the salt and the sugar and the fat that they have used to get us hooked on their products are not nutrients, he says, as much as weapons they deploy to keep us coming back for more. So David, is it an exaggeration? Is it hyperbole to say that the highly processed foods that today make up almost two-thirds of the calories eaten by Americans have been designed to create addiction? And if so, is this what you're referring to in your book when you speak of the biological warfare taking place on our plates?
It is. That is exactly what we're referring to. That, and Michael Moss did a wonderful job in calling it out, how our foods are incredibly manipulated to make them more addictive for us. And, I just want to go back to a moment to the social media part of what we're talking about, because understand that it's not just the purveyors of the food or whatever product happens to be being showcased in the pop-up ads. Time and time again, you research one thing and it pops up continually, and then you buy it. You have to, because it's continuing to gnaw at you. We know that the ads are cultivated based upon your previous online experience. And, even as it relates to interactions with social media, when our posts, when we put up a picture of us at the carnival or whatever it is, when those receive whatever, likes, thumbs up, hearts, whatever they are, that activates our reward circuits in our brains. That keeps us on social media and keeps us engaged in platforms that are further able to exploit our attention and our behavior. It's all about exploiting our behavior.
I'm sure that some of our listeners are today suffering from the consequences of a poor diet and would love to eat more healthfully. But for some reason, they don't seem to be able to muster the willpower or the clarity or the persistence or whatever it would take to have a stronger sense of agency and to feel more in control of their lives and their food choices. David, some experts say the power of addiction to today's highly processed foods can actually rival the power of addiction to hardcore drugs like heroin and cocaine. Are there, in fact, parallels between the opioid crisis and the obesity epidemic?
Yes. We're going to get back to this dichotomy, if you will, between the prefrontal cortex, the good decision maker, and the amygdala, the impulsive, I can't control myself decision maker, and recognize again that the disconnection, as part of disconnection syndrome, of those two areas allows the impulsivity, I want to take this drug, I want to do this thing now, center to go on its merry way and do what it wants. The adult has left the room. And one thing we know happens is that the connection, the ability of the adult to rein in that child is threatened by, in a word, inflammation. Now, inflammation is brought about by many things, many lifestyle choices we know fan the flames of inflammation. But one of the biggest issues these days that's absolutely blasting us with inflammation is this modern Western diet. So what I've just done is I have connected the decline in the quality of the foods that we are eating through the mechanism of inflammation to the increased risk that we have for inappropriate use of drugs and other addictions. The Western diet that is so pro-inflammatory is rapidly becoming the global diet. It is rapidly distancing brains across the world from the prefrontal cortex to a more primitive, locked-in, narcissistic, self-centered, nationalistic, xenophobic mindset, and we're seeing it happen globally.
We are, and we're seeing it happen in all of our dinner tables and breakfast tables too. I've seen surveys that show that for most Americans who eat breakfast every day, the common choice for breakfast is cold cereal, and of course, almost all of that has had a lot of added sugar. Others who don't eat the cold cereals reach for donuts and muffins and other highly processed foods that are almost desserts. They're high glycemic foods, and they're notorious for producing the inflammatory responses in our bodies that you're talking about. David, some of our listeners probably already know that chronic inflammation is linked to many of the diseases that afflict us today. What I want to ask you is this: does chronic inflammation also influence the brain, leading us to make poor decisions and act impulsively?
Inflammation threatens the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. It enhances disconnection syndrome. It takes the adult more out of the room and lets impulsivity, narcissism rule the day. So these become vicious cycles that lead to poor decision making, which tends to enhance poor decision making. And what we offer in the book, once we recognize these ideas, are off ramps, getting people off this highway that just leads down a rabbit hole of poor health and reduced longevity and unhappiness and sense of being disconnected and discontent. We offer the off ramps. Now, oftentimes they're not expected. As an example, as a physician dealing with a patient with type 2 diabetes, one would expect that seeing this new patient in my office, the first thing that I would be talking about that patient with, well, I guess in the mainstream office, it would be which drugs to take. But in my office, it would be, you would expect, let's talk about getting you on a better diet so that your blood sugars go down. We can restore insulin sensitivity and maybe throw in some exercise. No, it might be something else. Because first of all, recognize that a type 2 diabetic has been laboring over the diet question for decades, and they've not made the right choices. Obviously, if they would have, they wouldn't be in your office that day. So let's look at another hack, another entrance point, another off-ramp, if you will, of the superhighway. So it might well be more effective to try to amplify that person's decision-making ability so that in the future, he or she can make better decisions as they relate to food, which we know is fundamental for them. But maybe their decision-making ability is as a consequence to some degree because they don't get enough sleep, enough restorative sleep. So what do you say for the first couple of weeks in working with Mr. or Mrs. Jones that we're going to look at how well you're sleeping? We're going to give you a wearable device and try to determine how much sleep you get. And there are many of them out there that can determine the length of sleep that you get, how long it took you to go to sleep, what are the sleep stages, how much time in REM, how much time in deep sleep, etc. Look at the environment. Look at the time of day that you last consumed caffeine. Look at your blue light exposure in the all the things that make for less restorative sleep. Once we do that, or once this person engages in a meditation program, or once we encourage this patient to get out into nature or keep a gratitude journal, whatever are the entrance ramps that this person can do, because it seems unlikely they're going to be able to embrace dietary change first visit, let's work to restore decision-making as our primary goal. Then we will layer on those lifestyle choices, because what normally happens is a doctor sees a patient, he or she comes back 3 months later, they've gained weight, blood sugar is even higher, and what goes into the doctor's notes? That this patient is non-compliant. In other words, they're not following my recommendations. The finger is pointed at the patient. When that person gets home, he or she looks at himself in the mirror and points a finger and says, what in the heck is wrong with me? Why can't I do what the doctor said? And there's so much self-blame. And it gets back to so much of how we're being manipulated. And it's very difficult for people to first recognize that this is happening, and second, do anything about it. A couple moments ago, we were in the donuts and the cupcakes. It sounded great. If all things were equal and it didn't matter, I would be eating the donuts for breakfast like you described, and the muffins or whatever it was. But, that's the instantaneous desire that you light up in my mind when you said those things. But we were able to bring on the prefrontal cortex and say, yeah, that would be great, but you pay the price.
It seems to me that one of the ways we get disconnected from our prefrontal cortex, from our ability to make wise judgments and decisions and to move through life with clarity and contentment, is the food we eat and the lack of sleep that we sometimes don't get. And I've sometimes thought that the lack of nutritional education in medical schools is one of the greatest failings of Western medicine. But there's really another one too. I mean, getting enough sleep is clearly an important part of health and a key to healing. And yet, medical trainees and many practicing physicians actually seem to take pride in their ability to function, often for more than 24 hours straight without sleep. And David, I worry about this. What happens when a doctor wears his or her sleep deficit like some kind of badge of honor?
And we, during our training, even afterwards, are stroked when we stayed up all night and did something. And it's a big problem. I mean, there have been reforms made in residency training in the past decade to really address that, recognizing that big mistakes, life-threatening, life-challenging mistakes are made because decision-making is not as good as it could be when these young doctors in training are sleep deprived, and they are sleep deprived. It's been improved to some degree, but we would routinely be working all day, up all night, and then working all day the next day. And I can remember one of our attending physicians decided to add on a case at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I had been up all day, all night, all day, and he added on a case. And my job in this procedure was I had to hold the retractors to keep the brain away from where he was working to do something. It was actually epilepsy surgery. He was going to go into a place and neutralize an area of the brain. And I was holding these retractors, having now 36 hours of sleep deprivation, and I was almost hallucinating. And think about that. I mean, but even beyond that, what goes on in terms of decision making. So residencies is not a healthy time. During my second year of residency, had mumps, chickenpox, an ulcer, dysentery, and I think I was probably pretty depressed as well. And, it's stressful as it is. And you had sleep deprivation on top of that. Katie, bar the door.
Well, when you mention chickenpox and mumps, could it be that sleep deprivation makes us susceptible to infections by undermining the functioning of our immune systems?
100%. Yes, without a doubt. I think we've all been there, knowing that we have this situation whereby, you don't sleep for a while and the next thing you know, you got a cold. As we see this incredible explosion of the numbers of individuals in Western cultures who are overweight and frankly obese, sleep disorders are walking in lockstep with that. And then the downstream issues from sleep, lack of restorative sleep, follow, like immune compromise, like dramatic increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, and even certain cancers.
Well, as you list the many problems, serious problems that can ensue from chronic sleep deprivation, I'm thinking about how even before the pandemic, more than a third of all American adults were getting less than 7 hours of sleep per night, and many of them much less. And then the pandemic arrived, and it brought with it all kinds of stress and anxieties, and for many of us, far too many sleepless nights. Now, we have sleep experts telling us to engage in regular exercise, to establish a nightly bedtime routine, to cut back on screen time and social media, and that's all important, and that's all good advice. But I wonder sometimes if people might be overlooking another important factor that can contribute to poor sleep, and that is poor diet. And I've seen a lot of research finding that eating a diet, for example, that is high in sugar and saturated fat and processed carbohydrates disrupts sleep. And on the other hand, eating more plants and more fiber and foods rich in healthy fats seems to have the opposite effect. It helps to promote sound sleep. So, David, it seems to me that the foods we eat can affect how well we sleep, and also our sleep patterns can affect our dietary choices. Would you agree with that, or do you see it somewhat differently?
Yes, and what you're creating here is what exists, and that is the formation of these vicious cycles or feed forward, no pun intended, processes whereby it just gets worse and worse. In other words, the worse you sleep, the worse are your food choices, and the worse are your food choices, the worse you sleep. And again, that's part of the highway that we're trying to create these off ramps for, to allow people to finally break these cycles. You don't sleep well, you don't eat well. Yes, you don't probably think you're going to exercise as much. You may not take the time to connect to other people, to get out in nature, to meditate, to do all the things that you know are good for you, because your decision-making apparatus has been disrupted because you didn't get a good night's sleep.
We have seen a lot of studies showing that there's a strong link between COVID-19 mortality, bad outcomes from becoming infected with that virus, and conditions, comorbidities they're sometimes called, things like heart disease and diabetes and obesity and high blood pressure. And clearly, these kinds of chronic conditions have a huge connection to our diet and our lifestyle. So, David, do you think that what we eat and how we live can have a significant impact on COVID-19 outcomes? And if so, what are the top things you think anyone concerned about getting COVID-19 should bear in mind?
First question, yes, 100%. Second question, here we go. I think we've moved to a place today where we understand that the immune system is playing a very fundamental mechanistic role in the conditions that you mentioned, like high blood pressure, like diabetes, like coronary artery disease, like obesity. And when we recognize the pivotal role that the immune system is having in these inflammatory disorders, we have to understand that it's because the immune system is just not able to do what it used to be able to do. It's been compromised and therefore cannot rein in inflammation, if you will. The immune system becomes senescent or aged and less functional. So we want to recognize that there are lifestyle choices that speed that process of making our immune systems old and less adaptable, less functional. A senescent immune system, a senescent immune cell, one that's no longer able to function appropriately, churns out in its exhaust inflammatory mediators, cytokines. High levels of cytokines are seen in diabetes, they're seen in obesity, they're seen in coronary artery disease, they're seen in Alzheimer's disease. They're seen in the very things that you described are related to bad outcome as it relates to COVID.
David, I hear you saying that there are lifestyle choices and food choices that degrade our immune systems, and they promote inflammation, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. And that these food and lifestyle choices lead to an exhausted immune system that degrades and becomes prone to producing excessively high levels of cytokines. And this is important because we see high levels of cytokines in people with diabetes and in people with obesity. And this is one of the key reasons why people who have these conditions are very often the people who have the worst outcomes with COVID. David, is there also some good news in all of this?
The good news involved in this discussion is that we now know that this can be righted. We can right the ship. We can turn this around. You know, much of the stuff that you've been talking about for so many years about diet, for example, is so powerfully therapeutic on multiple levels, but vis-a-vis our conversation right now, relating to our immune function and therefore relating to our outcome as it relates to COVID-19 exposure. These things are under our control. When we eat the right kind of diet, we're able to rejuvenate our immune systems. We call this, now as a term, senotherapeutics. The therapeutics that are offered to these senescent cells, the older cells, to rejuvenate them. So there are techniques now called senolytic therapy, where we cause lysis or breakdown of old senescent cells and allow our bodies to take their place with newer, younger cells that can do the job without spitting out so much exhaust, without spitting out these cytokines. There are nutritional supplements that are able to do this. There are certain foods that are able to do this, and certain ways that we eat our food to amplify the process of digesting away cells that are no longer doing a good job. We call that autophagy. Auto, self, phagy, eat. We can amplify autophagy by engaging things like fasting or time-restricted eating. And there are even some supplements that can enhance this process. So the question is answered in the broadest way by saying, yes, our lifestyle choices play a role, a powerful central role in determining our outcome should we become infected with SARS-CoV-2.
You mentioned nutritional supplements, and I found myself thinking about one, melatonin, that a lot of people use to help with sleep. It's fairly widely known that it's a kind of a natural remedy to help people with sleep. But less well known, but perhaps very important today, is that in addition to melatonin's effects on sleep, it also plays a part in calibrating the immune system. And essentially what happens is melatonin acts as a moderator to help keep our self-protective responses from going haywire, which happens to be the basic problem that can quickly turn a mild case of COVID-19 into a life-threatening one. Now, some studies have found that people taking melatonin have significantly lower odds of developing COVID-19 and are far less likely to die of it. Last October, a study at Columbia University, for example, found that intubated patients had much higher rates of survival if they received melatonin. When President Trump was flown to Walter Reed for his COVID-19 treatment, his doctors prescribed, in addition to other experimental therapies, melatonin. There are currently at least 8 clinical trials that I know of that are ongoing around the world to see if these melatonin correlations bear out. Very few other treatments are receiving so much research attention. David, what's your view of melatonin in general, and do you have any thoughts about it as a possible aid against COVID-19?
I do. My thoughts are bullish in the positive sense. We've been talking about melatonin for decades as it relates to, some of the issues that you and I have been talking about thus far. There is publications dating back at least to March of this year looking at melatonin, not in terms of what it does to the immune system, but specifically how it might be repurposed and used therapeutically as it relates to this pandemic. And there are multiple studies that are ongoing looking at it in terms of risk of contracting COVID-19 and certainly outcome measurements as well. And I think that, globally, because of the availability of melatonin, a lot of institutions are just using it based on the knowledge of how melatonin affects both the innate and the adaptive immune systems, how we greet and then how we deal with this infection. We know that our melatonin levels decrease with age. And guess what? Who is it that is at higher risk for bad outcome as it relates to this infection? Elderly people, less melatonin. We know further, interestingly, that melatonin is highly regulated by our light-dark cycle, and that the risk of bad outcome in a general sense is greater the farther north or south of the equator people live. Now, the other explanation offered with respect to that observation is that the farther north or south the equator you live, the less sunlight you get, the more likely you are at having a lower level of vitamin D.
You mentioned vitamin D, which is, of course, a fat-soluble vitamin, which we know is crucial for the absorption of calcium and has many other critical biological effects. I recently saw a meta-analysis of 9 studies that all sought in their different ways to clarify the association between vitamin D and sleep disorders. And the meta-analysis researchers concluded that vitamin D deficiency is strongly associated with a higher risk of sleep disorders, including poor sleep quality and short sleep duration. It's clear from these and other studies that a deficiency in vitamin D impairs sleep. Now, I've also seen studies recently that show that a vitamin D deficiency is associated with a almost 4 times increase in the risk of dying from COVID-19. So do you think here too we have a natural remedy, a nutrient that we can get through our skin being exposed to the sun, or if we don't have enough of that, we can get it from a supplement, has a role to play in our response to COVID-19?
Well, the answer to that again is absolutely. And I think that it's interesting. It's even called a vitamin. I think we understand that the mechanism by which vitamin D works, which is manifold, is more along the lines of a hormone. But we know that vitamin D is intimately involved with the function and functionality of both the innate and the adaptive immune system. It works at so many levels, beginning at the gut and working its way through the body into the brain, modifies a gene expression of hundreds of genes, many of which deal with the immune system. Again, the data epidemiologically suggests that those individuals who have higher levels of vitamin D, at least that's one study out of Europe where it was correlated with higher levels having a better outcome. And they found, in fact, that vitamin D deficiency was associated with a higher risk of having a sleep disorder. A sleep disorder is a big problem in terms of insulin activity, blood sugar, and certainly immune function, inflammation, levels of stress hormone, the makeup of the gut bacteria. It's often overlooked, and it's of fundamental importance. We talk about diet, we talk about exercise, but no one spends 8 hours eating or exercising. Well, maybe somebody does, but we spend 8 hours sleeping. And it's conserved through all animals on the planet are involved in some form of sleep or other. It's that important. It's that valuable. And, I think so many people, when you interview them and as part of their intake to treat them, tell you I sleep 8 hours a night. And that's not good enough. I'm not saying it's not good enough because 8 hours isn't enough. It's not good enough to be satisfied with somebody telling you that they sleep 8 hours a night, because they may have terrible sleep. And we will never know that until we do a deeper dive into the quality, not just the quantity, but the quality of their sleep. How much time are they spending in REM? How long did it take to fall asleep? How much time are they spending in deep sleep? A time when the brain is cleaning itself up, taking out the garbage, if you will. So beyond just a person thinking he or she sleeps 8 hours a night, and they may not, they may be self-arousal, waking up, not even remembering it. They wake up in the morning and they say, I slept for 8 hours. So we really have to do the due diligence and recognize sleep for how important it is, number one. And number two, then how important it is that we assess the quality and quantity of an individual's sleep and then make changes to improve that if that's needed.
Listening to you, I'm struck by something. The importance, the primary importance, the essential importance of good food and good sleep to a healthy life. And yet, in medical training, in medical school, in the content of the coursework that medical students take, there is no discussion of the importance of healthy food, hardly at all, and very little discussion of the importance of healthy sleep. And in fact, the conditions that these folks are subjected to while they're going through their medical school and training basically gives them sleep disorders and leads them to make poor food choices themselves. And then they function as doctors without knowing how important these things are. And here you are, David, and this is my point. Here you are, an esteemed physician, an esteemed neurologist, telling us how important healthy sleep is, how important healthy food is, and that when we eat healthy food and when we get healthy sleep, those are two things that help us to break the disconnection syndrome so that we can now feel connected to ourselves, each other, the world, and our highest potentials for basically accomplishing the purposes for which we were born, the purposes that give our life meaning. And I think that's just beautiful coming from a physician of your stature.
Well, I appreciate that. It's very kind. And years ago, I read a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. It said, "Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." And, I never wanted to follow the mainstream path, because I didn't like what it was all about, where it was going and the goal. So I decided to go my own way. And what I like about the quote is it says, leave a trail. And to me, that's what distinguishes that one from two roads diverge in the wood. And I cannot travel both. I took the one less traveled, etc. So I took the alternative trail, but you leave a trail behind you so that there may be others who recognize this message as having merit.
Well, I appreciate that, David. And, for years you've been telling us that we don't have to be victims of poor health. We do not have to live lives of loneliness. And we don't have to be prisoners of the urge to pursue the next short-term fix. And now you're giving us ways we can reconnect with ourselves and with the true nature of life, and ways that we can activate the very brain pathways that bring clear thinking and that allow us to have deep and meaningful relationships and that provide us with mental and emotional well-being and contentment. It's always a joy for me to have these chances to talk with you, David, and today has certainly been no exception. And on behalf of Ocean and myself, and everyone involved in the food revolution, and frankly, everyone living in a human body and everyone living on Earth in any body, I thank you for your deep commitment to all that brings joy and health and beauty into our lives and into our world. And of course, for being with us today.
Well, thank you, John and Ocean. I appreciate all that you guys are doing. It's just helping to move the ball down the field. And so I'm sure with your listeners, there's a lot of gratitude towards you guys for what you're doing.
Well, the gratitude goes in every direction. We've been talking here with neurologist Dr. David Perlmutter, co-founder and president of the Perlmutter Brain Foundation and best-selling author of numerous books, including Brainwash, Detox Your Mind for Clearer Thinking, Deeper Relationships, and Lasting Happiness. David, your research and your wisdom are helping all of us move towards more satisfying sleep, towards healthier brains, and towards more fulfilling lives. We are so grateful for your wisdom and for your partnership in the food revolution.
Thank you again.
This concludes our interview, but our work is just getting started. If you feel supported and encouraged by what you just heard and want to share it with people you care about, if you want permanent access to 24 amazing presentations and transcripts, then check this out. You can get a download and a transcript of the entire Food Revolution Summit, plus a huge collection of ebooks, courses, trainings, recipes, and videos. And this empowerment package is available for a huge 50% discount between now and the end of the summit. For more information, please visit foodrevolution.org/empowerment. Again, that's foodrevolution.org/empowerment. Thank you for joining us in the Food Revolution, and we wish you and those you love good health always.